This is Bob Andelman, and today on Mr. Media, I'll talk to Tampa Bay Rays TV announcer Dewayne Staats. The former broadcast partner of Harry Caray, Tony Kubek, Joe McGrain, and Gene Elston has just published his memoir, Position to Win, a look at baseball and life from the best seat in the house. Stick around, and next time you're in scoring position with the game, or the girl, on the line, think of Dewayne Staats. There are some genuinely, truly nice people in the world. Now, you might not know this if your only friends are Facebook friends, but it's true. And I suspect Dewayne Staats is one of those good guys. For one thing, I've read his just-published memoir of life in a baseball broadcast booth, and Staats hasn't an unkind word to share about pretty much anyone. Now, that may just be good manners, of course, but his co-author on Position to Win, a look at baseball and life from the best seat in the house, is Dave Scheiber, another one of the nicest guys in America. Staats has been the play-by-play man for the Tampa Bay Rays since their inception 18 years ago, which has included everything from Wade Boggs pitching to the hit show to a trip to the World Series and several playoffs in between. But before coming to St. Petersburg, Staats worked side by side with some of baseball's greatest voices, including Harry Caray with the Cubs, Tony Kubek with the Yankees, and his boyhood hero and eventual partner, Gene Elston with the Astros. Now, as a Rays fan since, forever, and someone who wrote a book about the long gestating creation of the Tampa Bay baseball franchise, I couldn't resist an urge to talk to the voice of the team. Dewayne Staats, welcome to Mr. Media.
Bob, thank you so much. It's great to be with you.
Great to be here with you. I appreciate your time. I got to ask, are you really that nice a guy, or did you kind of learn from your years in the baseball business not to drink and tell?
Well, you don't want to drink and tell, that's for sure. And I hope that I'm genuinely a nice guy. I try to be. And raising two daughters, they will tell you that worse than any other discipline that they could undergo was to come into my office and sit in the big chair and hear the lecture about being a good person. So that's what we're all trying to do.
Well, and I got to tell you, my favorite story in the book is actually involves one of your daughters and a baseball player. Steph, I guess, got to know, took an interest in a Rays player when he was very young, Dan Wheeler.
She did, yes.
And at some point had to meet the family. And I wonder if you want to share that with people.
Well, we obviously grew up around this game. So did Steph. My late wife, Dee, was not only an excellent mother, but you knew where you stood with her from the opening moments of meeting her, which was great. She had a great feel for people. Steph also not only had grown up around the game, but had done some work with visiting broadcast crews as a statistician and stage manager. And so she was around them a lot. And our rule was it's really not a good idea to date baseball players. And so as fate would have it, she and Dan did meet, had mutual interest, and had gone out on a few dates. And so at the end of the season, in fact, I think it was the last game of the season, and Dan had one of his short appearances with the Major League club up here early in his career, had actually gotten his first win that day. But the important item on the agenda that day was to join us for dinner at a local restaurant here in Indian Rocks Beach, one of our favorite Italian spots. And so he had not met Dee. I had good scouting reports on Dan, not only as a pitcher, but he grew up in the Rays organization. So I had an idea of what he might be about. Dee, on the other hand, had not met him. And so Steph brought him. Dee and I were already sitting at the table. They entered. He was standing in front of the table before sitting down when Steph decided to do the introductions. And she said, Dan, this is my mother, and Mom, this is Dan. And so Dee said, right off the cuff, let me tell you something. I don't like baseball players. They're philanderers. They don't save their money. And she had a whole laundry list, and she let him know what that laundry list was. And so she looked up at him and she said, so what makes you different? And I'm thinking, if he can face her, he has a chance to get big league hitters out. And I thought his response was pretty good under the circumstances. He said, "I think I know what you're saying, and I like to think I'm different." And she said, "Well, sit down." And so we had a nice dinner, and that was the beginning of what has been a great marriage for Steph and Dan, and 3 grandchildren later. So we're very grateful for that.
It's very nice. It's a great moment for Dee, and it's one of those moments where I have to say sometimes the family moments are more interesting than the baseball moments, because we know some of the baseball stuff that goes on, but suddenly to get a little peek behind the curtain was nice.
Yeah, it's an interesting life. There's no question about that. I'm not sure I would know what to do in any other lifestyle. You do make some sacrifices, but the upside, I think, far outweighs those. Dee, with 2 girls, they were born 6 years apart. I was gone a lot, as we all are in this business, so she ran the show, rode herd on the 2 girls, took care of business. I've always thought she could have maybe operated any company and been a CEO anywhere she wanted to choose. She was that good.
What prompted you to write a book at this point in your career?
Well, when I went to Chicago, I was in my early 30s. I had an opportunity to go up there. And there was a gentleman who published books, and he, the first year or so, came and says, "You should write a book." And I thought, I'm only 32. What can I put in it? Well, that was a few decades ago. And so I've accumulated some experience, some stories. But I think selfishly, the reason I did this has to do with the 3 grandchildren. They're 10, 7, and 4. I wanted them to have something that they could pick up and hold, be in their possession, and read. And somewhere down the line, when I'm gone, they may read this or have their children read it, so they'd have an idea, what their grandfather was all about. Maybe those to come would know what their great-grandfather's about. So from a selfish point of view, that's really a great impetus for me. And then Dave Scheiber, who and who is such a good writer and journalist, he's an award winner, obviously, in those areas, has been great with other books he's written, including Covert, and that's a whole other story. But if anyone gets a chance to pick that one up and read it, they absolutely should. Dave's just that good. Dave and I had become friends. Of course, he's been local here. Not only are we friends, but we found out we were compatible in a project like this. And so we got together and talked about it, recorded some of the background and some of the stories, and sat down, did some of the writing together, and it was really an enjoyable experience.
Did you learn much about yourself in the process? And I ask that because I'm always interested in people who do memoir, because if they turn out, for them to turn out well, you really you have to get kind of introspective, don't you? You have to kind of look at yourself almost from the outside.
Yeah, I had a couple teachers in high school. I love sports, and I was so focused on that. But I did have a couple teachers who demanded that I be interested in other things, and they exposed me to philosophy and literature and all of that. And I remember them telling me that the Socratic method was really great, and the classics. And they said, an unexamined life is not worth living. So I tried to keep tabs as we go. I think, every once in a while you do a self-check on if you are where you want to be. Have you made progress? Are you the person you want to be? I think what I really found from this exercise with Dave, as you go back, there are things that you recall that maybe you had tucked away in that closet of your mind somewhere that you hadn't thought about. And as we examined all of those, it occurred to me how blessed I've really been. How many people get to do exactly what they want to do, and then have the family that we've had and the friends that we've had. And that really, that was the point that this exercise brought home to me about the time I've been on this planet.
You kind of got your start in the same way. Well, you took an interest in baseball the same way a lot of us did, certainly at a certain generation, a certain eras. Listening to the AM radio late at night, you're getting the skip signals, and you're in the Midwest, you're hearing from all over the place. I remember going to sleep every night with the AM radio in the earplug, so my parents couldn't tell I was listening to baseball that late at night. My grandfather gave me the radio in the earplug and told me how to do that.
I know, such rebels, weren't we?
Oh yeah, it's terrible. The trouble we would get into listening to baseball games.
Yeah.
But yours took an interesting twist in that you started writing to one of the announcers that you listened to, right? Gene Elston. Do you want to tell folks a little about that?
Yeah, I did. I grew up in one of the great baseball areas of all time around St. Louis. All my friends were Cardinal fans. Handful were Cub fans because we lived across the river in Illinois. And so I had all of those friends who were either Cardinal or Cub fans, and mostly Cardinal fans. And I was probably 9 years old, I think, when I first became aware of Major League Baseball to a significant point. That was the 1961 World Series between the Reds and the Yankees. Well, in 1962, the National League had two new teams, the Mets and a franchise in Houston, then the Colt 45s. Well, there was a combination of interest there, I think. We all loved Westerns back then, Gene Autry and Roy Rogers and Hopalong Cassidy, and I loved baseball. And all of a sudden one night, purely by happenstance, I ran across a Colt 45 broadcast on that little radio that you're talking about. I was fascinated by that. Here I was in a little town in southern Illinois. I knew the Cardinals were across the river and upstate the Cubs, but suddenly from this place called Texas, where I envisioned the Wild West, there was a Major League Baseball team, and I somehow could listen in to their games every night. Well, that became a ritual for me. The parents going to make you go to bed, and you're in there, and much like you, sneaking a listen to the radio. And I thought Gene Elston, that crew, they had Gene Elston and Lowell Pass were the primary broadcasters there, and Lowell was he had more of a kind of a carnival barker side to him and a folksy side to him. And Gene gave you baseball. And there was a pleasant quality to his voice, a great cadence to it. And I think I really learned pacing from him when I was probably 9 or 10 or 11, 12 years old. But to get back to your original question about writing, I just, for some reason, thought that it made a lot of sense to send him a letter. And I did that back in the Colt 45 days. In fact, I retained a couple of those letters on Colt 45 stationery that he sent back. There was one from 1966 when I started to develop an interest maybe in broadcasting, thinking about that. I had sent a letter to him about various things about the club. They were the Astros by then. They had a first baseman named Walt Bond. He lived in nearby Alton. I was trying to see if I could somehow connect with him. And then, of course, asked for the autographs and things like that. So Gene was kind enough to send returns to me, which I thought was, that was another world. The major leagues to a 9, 10, 11-year-old kid, it really is on another plateau of existence. So he sent those back to me, and that really started our relationship. And when I developed a keener interest, more serious interest in broadcasting, I would ask him, send letters and ask him direct questions about, the level of enthusiasm you needed, what steps did it really require to become a broadcaster, and his advice to me, I thought, was right on point. He said, listen, you should get as much education as you can and try to put that together with practical experience. And so that's the road I took from that advice.
But I got to ask you a question, see, because about the same age, and it may have been around the same time, I sent letters to Monty Irvin and Bowie Kuhn at the commissioner's office and got responses, but I didn't become commissioner of Major League Baseball. So do you? This is true. I actually did that.
You may have done yourself a favor.
Well, I don't know. Considering the some of the numbskulls that have come in and out of that office, I think I could have done a better job than Bud Selig. I don't have to be as nice as Dewayne. I can say what I think. But here's my question: do you think that kind of the way you got your start all those years ago, and that it could be duplicated today? I mean, the guy, the kid who wrote the letters to Gene Elston developed a relationship. I think today, unfortunately, if parents found those letters, they'd be like suspicious, wouldn't they, of a kid and a grown man being pen pals?
Well, that might be the case. It's sad if it is, but we live in the times in which we live. I think it's still possible. I'm not sure. The world to me, as I look back, seemed a lot simpler then. Number one, the games were on radio. TV wasn't the presence it was. TV's taken so many different forms now. Communication, the way we're doing this, was unheard of. So I think that's twofold. I think number one, there's a lot more outlet to ply your trade to try to make it better now, and I think there's still that great opportunity to communicate with as kids grow up and become middle school and high school and college, they start to define their interests. And I think there's opportunities to reach out to professionals. I used to get letters. Now you get, something electronic, so much more. But I hear from students, a couple of students from Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville that went through their program, that were going through their program, that felt comfortable enough to contact me. I try to respond to them. Excuse me, Gene just recently passed away. He was 93 years old and had a great, wonderful life. And I talked with his son, Kim, about the arrangements they may have. And Gene was, for a broadcaster, pretty understated. He didn't seek the limelight, and even in death did not do that. He wanted a very simple process at the end of his life, and that's what he got. Nothing ceremonial. But Kim's response to me was, he said, listen, this is what my dad would like. He said, he thought so much of you, and I know that I felt the same way. And so he said, the greatest thing you could do for him is to pass it on. And that's what I hope that I've done in a couple of occasions, and hope that I will continue to do, because that's what he did with me.
Well, I want to ask you one more thing about Gene, and then I actually want to talk to you about a little bit about each of the major names that you've worked with in the booth. Tell folks a little something about Gene's style, because it was different than most of the people you work with subsequently.
It was. Gene was as thorough. I took things from him. Those were the days when you didn't have as much information at your disposal as we do now. And Gene kept a lot of that. He kept, some guys keep little black books for other reasons. He kept a little black book that had situational information in it about players on, in this case, the Colt 45s of the Astros roster. He allowed me to take a peek into that, and I tended to duplicate that and use it. He told me once that you should never remember anything where you can look it up. And so I've not forgotten that. So he did things like that. He was so thorough. He was the team statistician in the early years of the Houston franchise, as well as their lead broadcaster. So I think he was thorough. He paced the game as well as anybody. Jack Buck once told me, when we had a conversation about Gene entering the Hall of Fame, he said, no one ever paced a game better than Gene Elston. And I think that's true. I think it was never about him. It was about the game. And I think that's important. We like to have fun with what we do. I think you need to be personable. But what I learned from Gene was to be absolutely thorough, serious about what you're doing, be pleasant about it, and never put yourself before the game, because that's why we were there to begin with.
And then you work with a guy who's completely different. The immortal, the legendary, holy cow, Harry Caray. I mean, how do you go from one style, working with one style, to a completely different style? Chicago
was an interesting market for me. I was a young guy getting this great opportunity. And what we did, I wound up going up there and did 6 innings on radio and 3 on TV, and Harry and I would flip-flop. He'd do 6, obviously, on TV and still come into radio and do the middle 3. And then there were still non-TV dates, and we would do those together on radio. What I learned from Harry and Chicago, Chicago's a great personality market. People in the Midwest, on the East Coast, in New York, you have media, you have Broadway. On the West Coast, you had TV and movie stars, TV stars, all of that. In the Midwest, in a big city like Chicago, they had their own local media people, and they became, in that same sense, celebrities there. And WGN, because it was a superstation, then made that nationwide, in some senses international. And so Harry became even bigger than he had ever been. But the market itself is a personality-driven market. I worked with Lou Boudreau on radio. Lou, as we know, a Hall of Fame player, was a player manager in his 20s with the Cleveland Indians, and then became a broadcaster. Well, Lou, for an example, if you had him in a broadcast performance class, might have struggled. But he was one of the outstanding broadcasters, because I've never been around anyone who anticipated the game better, but people related to him. His syntax may not have been accurate and perfect, but people related to him as the guy next door. The personality carried the day, and his competence. Well, Harry was the same way. He was perfect in the personality side. So I learned that it's important to be a human being and to have fun with this and be personable. Harry once told me that when he was a kid in St. Louis, he would listen to the games in the early years of radio, and then he would sneak his way into the ballpark. And he said it was always so much more fun and exciting at the ballpark than when he listened. And I think he tried to convey the actual experience of being at the ballpark and his personality. And at the same time, it didn't hurt because it served his own purposes. Harry knew what he was doing. He was promoting Harry Caray, and there was nothing wrong with that. That was part of his shtick and part of the act that he made successful.
I'm thinking that working with Harry and Lou Boudreau in Chicago probably prepared you well then for jumping to New York. You went to the Yankees and worked with Tony Kubek, who was not as big a personality as Harry, but was a great former ball player. As you would work with Lou. Am I overstating this? It seems like he would fall right in the middle of that experience level and that style.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. He was. He brought a little of all of that. He brought some of Gene with him as well, I think, from my background. Tony always felt that the game was the important thing, that we were there and should never get in the way of the game. And yet, as analysts go, he was as good, I think, as anyone I've ever seen. I've worked with some really great analysts, including a couple of interesting guys here who I've enjoyed. Brian Anderson. I think Brian can be as good as he wants to be and can write his own ticket. I think Joe McGrain, for the years that we spent together here, was entertaining and also very insightful. I enjoyed those guys. Kubek was, for me, if you had four faces to put on the Mount Rushmore of analysts, he'd be the first guy you'd put up there.
Wow, that's high praise.
He was never at a loss for what was going on. The nature of baseball is you'll have excitement, and then you'll have a down period. It's up and down. And sometimes broadcasters are really searching for things to be relevant to talk about. That never happened with Tony. He knew something was going on that field or around that game all the time. I was consistently amazed at how good he was at that and how comfortable he was. He just saw it. And then maybe it was part of being a middle infielder. It also had to do with being bright and love what you're doing and all of that. But Kubek was just the best. And I think I said in the book, and I don't know if it's hyperbole or not, I said my father was the most honest man I've ever met. And next to him, I think Kubek is exactly that same way. I was fortunate enough to spend time having dinner and relaxing with Tony. We'd have conversations about baseball, but things across the board, politics, the social side of life, all of those things. And I just thought his opinions were heartfelt and honest. His wife, Margaret, would tell you that he's a bit of a contrarian, and that made him fun, and that was part of the color of Tony.
My second favorite story in the book, speaking of Tony and his ability to be ready to talk about something at all times, my second favorite story in the book is the one day that you ran into trouble with Gene Elston when I think you were down on the field and you were supposed to be able to talk, and you had nothing to say, and it was one, I think you say it's kind of the one time that he gave you a hard time and said, you just can't do that. You got to always be ready.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. Gene was very big on preparation. And it turned out it was an exhibition game and I think we were in San Antonio. It's amazing how you can recall these moments like that. My job was to fill up to the beginning of the game and then bring on Gene to start the play-by-play. And for some reason, there was a delay. And I found myself repeating things I had said and frankly, just struggling as a first-year broadcaster. And so Gene waited. And then the next day, talked to me, and he was fairly blunt about that. He said, "I just want to let you know that I thought you," and in this case, we could say whatever we want, and I don't think people would object to a direct quote. But he said, "I think you fell on your ass yesterday," and so here I was. I think probably 24 at the time, getting this opportunity and this chance. You don't want to blow it, so I took that seriously. And as you look back, I had. That was a great bit of constructive criticism there. In fact, I mentioned his son, Kim, and in the aftermath of Gene's death, and I told Kim that story when we were in Houston. He's still in Houston and works on their TV crew there. So I told him about that story, and he laughed. And then when we talked after Gene's death, he said, pass it on. And he says, and pass on some of that tough love that my dad gave to you as well. So I think that's a good piece of advice, and I'll certainly do that.
Well, bringing the whole story kind of forward a bit, the season before Joe Magrane, I think I have this right. The season before Joe Magrane left the Rays broadcast booth, or maybe it was 2 seasons. You'll correct me, I'm sure. Brian Anderson joined the team. Sort of, it seemed like on an occasional tryout basis as a fill-in, that kind of thing. I tell you honestly, I thought he was rather an acquired taste after Magrane's bombast, but I'd have to admit that I think he's at least as good as Magrane now, maybe better. What did you think you were getting into with your new partner at the time?
Well, it was interesting. Well, the number one, I had already handled one left-hander for 10 years in that booth. And so Joe obviously could be provocative, and you might have to redirect a conversation sometimes to keep him from getting himself into trouble. So, and at the same time, a mercurial personality, and I thought BA had a lot of that same quality that he brought. Who knew exactly what you were going to get into? I think BA filled in a handful of games when Joe had gone to cover the Olympics. He did a stint covering baseball in the Olympics. And I think that's when Brian filled in. And that first game that Brian did in Oakland, he was admittedly a fish out of water. He said he went home or went back to the hotel and berated himself at what a poor job he thought he had done. Well, I thought that was a good sign that, number one, a guy cared that much about doing a good job. And when we discussed his performance in the aftermath, I said, look, you know the game. You have an upbeat personality. You should relax and you should have fun with this and just allow yourself to naturally get into the flow of what we're going to do. And I think he did relax, and I think that was a step in the right direction for him. And I think he's continued to do that.
Yeah, I find the more I hear him, the more I enjoy it, and I think he's gotten better at it. So there's some questions I've always had about play-by-play guys in baseball, and since you're in front of me, you're going to get the questions. At what point in every season, and I'm sure this has got to be the case, do you wish you were anywhere else but the ballpark? I mean, football is 16 games in a football season, 8 home, 8 on the road. Baseball is more than 10 times as long, and in a losing season, I'm sure it can feel like 100 times as long. you got to have that moment at some point in the season where you wish you were anywhere but in the booth, right?
Well, my honest response to that, and I don't want to sound too Pollyannish about this. It is a long season. I'll grant you that. When you're losing, it's an even longer season. In an interesting sort of way, it's more fulfilling because it's a greater challenge when you have a bad ball club. When you have an '08 season, well, everybody's the greatest. The manager's a genius. The broadcasters are the best of all time because you're winning, and you have a storyline right there with every game that you play. You have a team that's trying to win the division. You have a team trying to win the pennant. Every pitch, there's something that really is riding on that pitch. So there's a little more of a challenge when you have a team that's not so good. I've always thought that there are great human interest angles in this game because it is a process and not an event. It mirrors life in so many ways. Every day of our lives, hey, I'm happy to be alive every day. Every day is not going to be the greatest day of your life. So you work your way through it. You look for that angle. And that's what I try to do during a losing season. And I look back, and maybe you asked me earlier about what did this book teach me? What did I learn from it? And I think that's part of recognizing just how fortunate and how blessed I've been to do exactly what I wanted to do. This is what I set out to do. So, the Rays can go through frustration. They've had a number of those, particularly in extra innings this year. It's not been a pretty sight. But you go back the next day and you play it because it truly is a privilege to get to do this. And again, I know that some people are going to think, well, that's a Pollyannish point of view. But I have to tell you, that's the truth. Would I prefer they win? There's no question about that. The job's easier. Everyone's in a good mood. When they lose, do you hear some grumping here and there? Absolutely. Do I do some grumping? I'm sure that I do. But at the end of the day, when it comes time, we're in the fourth or fifth inning of that game, and you're going to have to make a living doing something. And to do this and actually get paid for it, I think it's a pretty good proposition.
Yeah, I was thinking about it because as much as I love baseball, and I love my baseball, I was a Mets fan, I was a Yankees fan, I was a Mets fan, I grew up there. My grandfather took me to the Shea Stadium, Yankee Stadium, the Vet, all these places, and I love baseball. But now as an adult, if my team is losing, and the Rays are my team, and the last 2 seasons have been kind of hard to bear at times, I can turn off the game. I can go and do something else, or I can do something else while I have the game in the back. You're stuck. And I just think that's just got to be, when you get to, when you're heading into the All-Star break and you've lost, your team has lost 8 to 10 in a row, and you've got to be there every day and try to find something positive and not let it get to you. I just think that's got to be a really tough part of the job.
You know what you've done for me? The next time they're in that situation, I'm going to think of Bob and I go, he's about to turn off TV. What can we do to keep him? We have to keep this audience. So that's the challenge.
Well, and that leads perfectly into my next question. I mean, in the book, you talk a lot about preparation of statistics and facts and always having that kind of stuff ready and be knowledgeable. But what I'm wondering about is the actual play-by-play. I mean, do you perpetually look for new ways to say the same things, like talking about the pitch count or double plays or a closer who left the barn door open one too many times? And no, there's no way I'm talking about Brad Boxberger. How do you keep the actual description of the game fresh day to day? Is it even possible?
Yeah, I think you need to. Baseball can, in many ways, it's repetitive. You're every few seconds a guy's going to make a pitch. All of those pitches are different and situations are different. The way you describe that, I think, also needs to be different. And so what I hope I can do, I hope there's enough of a vocabulary there where you can use a variety of phrases and words to apply to situations. I've never been there. There are some catchphrases that broadcasters tend to use, and some of them are known for that. I try to throw a few of those in here and there, but I try never to rely on the same thing over and over and over again. And I think there's a combination of reasons for that. One is I'm not the reason they're there. We're there because of the game. So I want to give the game its due. No two home runs are the same. And you're going to describe them, hopefully, as accurately as you can. So I think, and I do think you need to change it up. Same way if you're pitching, you're going to have to move the ball around the strike zone. You're going to have to change speeds. You're going to have to do all those things to be effective. And I think it's the same way, the way we call a game. That's changed a little bit, the actual play-by-play. In the early years, I did tons of radio, way more descriptive. You are way more involved. You're more supplemental as well as descriptive with TV. And I think we get to be more and more that way. The more the technology evolves. But the technology also gives us an opportunity then to go to the varying forms of technology and talk about that and see things because of that we would not have seen before. So I guess my approach on TV is to be conversational, but to engage the viewer, the listener, and my partner into more conversation about the many different things that we can see now that when we did strictly radio, number one, you couldn't see them. And in the early days of TV, replay was pretty limited, so you didn't see as much then. So there's always something to talk about.
Well, one of the things that I think has dramatically improved the TV broadcast in the last 20 or so years is that third man. Now, there have been booths that have had three men in the booth. Famously, Monday Night Football always had three men in the booth. But what the Rays do, and I think a lot of other teams do or have gone to, is that you and Brian Anderson in the booth, you've got Todd Callis out in the stadium kind of roaming around, and you've got, and I apologize, I don't know the young woman's name. She's beautiful. I can't think of her name at the moment.
Yeah, Emily Austin is with us.
Emily Austin. And so you have the ability to throw to them and get some color into the games that even technologically wasn't possible 20 years ago. The wireless and everything. Has that, you've overlapped those two eras when it was strictly play-by-play with a little color to, hey, it's play-by-play and color commentary. Oh, and let's go out and see what's happening out in the stands. Has that been a good thing in your view?
I think it mirrors the evolution of our society, and there was a time when there was not the competition. Baseball was the game. You had football, and then basketball, hockey was pretty much limited with the exception of a couple cities in Canada. Now there are franchises in all these major sports and individual sports, so it's across the board. I think you have to do that. You're going to appeal to, I think what Brian and I try to do is appeal to the baseball fan in the audience. And even then, I fully understand that we're going to have very serious baseball fans. We're going to have then fans at the other end of the spectrum, just being introduced to the game, maybe not as aware of some of the intricacies of the game. We have to speak to all of those people. And I think having Todd and Emily and the folks in the roles that they carry out, I think it's important to do that. I think they have to necessarily, in everything we do, whether it's selling a book or selling whatever shows on TV or baseball or whatever sport it is, I think you have to broaden the demographics as much as you can and still stay true to the event that you're broadcasting.
All right. Dewayne, I got just a couple more questions, and I know you got to get to the ballpark. Can you stick around a couple more minutes?
Sure. Be happy to.
All right. So I started the interview by talking about what a nice guy you seem to be based on the book and certainly years of watching and hearing you in the booth. But I want to test this a little bit. The Rays, our Tampa Bay Rays, formerly the Tampa Bay Devil Rays, have had a number of managers in 18 seasons, from the original Larry Rothschild through Hal McRae, Lou Piniella, to the winningest, Joe Madden, and now the least experienced, Kevin Cash. You're going to hate this, but I would like you to rate them from best to worst.
Well, it's interesting, and I don't want to avoid that, but I'll give you my reaction to all of them.
All right.
At the beginning, people would ask me, what kind of manager is Larry Rothschild? because all of these guys are in different sets of circumstances, different budgets, different teams, different aims. You have an expansion team. So Larry Rothschild is a manager, and you say, well, how do you evaluate? Is this guy a good manager or not? You're going to give him essentially cast-offs from the rest of baseball. And I thought the only way to truly evaluate Larry and his staff was to figure out how much progress they could make, because you're taking an incomplete player in the ideal sense, and you're trying to develop him into a better player. How many players did they make better? I think that's how you evaluate a guy in that first few years of an expansion club. I don't think if you give Larry, today's Toronto Blue Jays, you're going to evaluate him completely different. So I thought tough to evaluate him as a manager. He had that shot, an excellent pitching coach, and he went back to doing what he probably does best, and that was a pitching coach. You put him on a team that should contend. Now you can evaluate him as to what kind of a manager he was. I thought Hal McRae was in a similar situation. You have to have a nucleus of talent and then some depth to do that. So evaluating expansion team managers is much different, I think, than evaluating guys who come later. Lou Piniella. Lou had great success at different clubs. That winning this year in Seattle they had and all that. Disappointed that they didn't finish the job up there. And Lou found himself in a difficult spot here too. I think he anticipated that he could generate a higher payroll and contend. That never materialized, so it was largely frustrating for Lou here. I thought Madden was exceptional in that he came into a situation, he recognized that it had a chance to move in the right direction. This was not a good team when he came here, but he finally got an opportunity to manage. And I think in hindsight, Joe was probably a better manager here than some people thought he was, and they thought he was a pretty good manager. I think he did a great job of integrating all the information, the analytics that are so popular today with some of the traditional approaches to the game. And I think we'll see Kevin Cash do the same. This franchise is heavy in analytics, and I think that's a good thing to a point. I'm not sure it's the be-all and end-all. People want to go back to Billy Ball and that whole idea of Moneyball, actually. I think of Billy Beane, but Moneyball, there was some positives in that. I'm not sure I'm a complete believer in that. So I guess what I've done is filibuster and avoided rating those guys. I think Cash. So I guess I'd have to say that Madden is the best manager they've had, because you can look at wins and losses. But he also had maybe the best opportunity, and we'll wait and see on Kevin Cash. I think first year out, first time managing. I think he would be in some cases self-critical, but he's trying to do the same thing. He's trying to integrate the right thing to do for those 25 guys he has at any one time on the roster with the analytics and make that work. And I think he has a healthy appreciation of the analytics. And I think going forward, I think this first year has been a tremendous learning experience for him. And I have every reason to think that Cash could be as good a manager as Joe Madden. As Joe Madden.
McGrain wishes he could do that.
Exactly. As good a job as Madden, but it's a process that he's still growing into.
All right, fair enough. I would take from what you said that you would put Rothschild at the bottom, maybe McRae just above him. But I don't want to put words in your mouth. I would think that Cash would probably fit somewhere between McRae and Lou Piniella at this point. A year from now, if he turns around the raw material he has and continues to inspire young people and stops making what I think a lot of us would agree would be just kind of rookie mistakes, he could put himself somewhere between Piniella and Madden. That would be
yeah. And I think I think because of the body of work, you have to go Madden. You know what Lou's done; they're known commodities. Kevin is a developing commodity, and the other guys were in impossible situations to succeed to begin with. So how you evaluate them, and did they make players better? Because they certainly didn't win any more games than anyone anticipated they would.
Well, you also have to compare the team owners that they toiled under. Rothschild, McRae, and Piniella had the misfortune of being under Mr. Namoli, very tight with a buck and very full of himself, and Madden and now Cash have the good fortune to be under Sternberg and Matt Silverman, which is a very different situation.
Yeah.
Okay, so how many more years do you think you'll do this?
I still enjoy going to the ballpark every day, and if we have the blessing of good health and the desire to do it, I could see myself doing this into the future. What I have found, and we all have to be a little, I think, a little compulsive to be in this business, to do a game every day. The last year or so, I found myself taking 4, 5, 6 games off during the year, and I found that refreshing. I did that. I put a series together with the All-Star break this year, and as a family, we went to North Carolina, and it was great to be there with the grandkids and have that time, a time that you don't get back because they grow so quickly. So I think on that basis, going forward, doing pretty much a full season and taking a day off here or there, I'd love to do this for as long as I'm physically and mentally and emotionally capable.
Great. Well, folks, listen, you can find the Sportscaster memoir, Position to Win, a look at baseball and life from the best seat in the house by Dewayne Staats with Dave Scheiber in great bookstores everywhere. Or you can order it right now at a great price at MrMedia.com. If you're watching this on MrMedia.com, you know how this works. Somewhere below the video to the left or right, you'll see the cover of the book. Click on it. Order it from Amazon. They can have it to you, I think, in 30 minutes or less via drone. Maybe that's not true. Maybe you have to wait a day. Or you can get it electronically. But anyway, order it here, order it now. Dewayne, is there a website for the book?
There is, there's a website, but most of what we've done has been through Amazon and through Barnes & Noble, and with your assistance as well. There is a Position to Win Facebook page, and the publisher is Advanced Publishing, Inc., and you can find them on the website as well.
Very good. Dewayne Staats, a pleasure to talk to you today, have you on the show, read your book. Continued good luck. Bring our Rays some luck. Get them ready for another season, and thank you so much for joining us on Mr. Media today.
I certainly appreciate the time. It's been fun being with you, and we'd be happy to do it again someday.
Mr. Media is recorded live before a studio audience of second-rate ball players who, whenever they get to third base, have visions of meatloaf in their heads, keep swearing on their mother's graves, and screaming, "I'll love you to the end of time!" In the new media capital of the world, St. Petersburg, Florida. Man, you look like the guy that you literally look like the guy on the cover of the book.
Hey, we want to be consistent,
I'm telling you. Or is it one of those cases where you have 10 suits and 10 shirts, but they're all the same color?
You got it. Really, I have 10 white shirts, 10 pairs of jeans, and 10 blue blazers.